sort of short term, and they're just in comparison to the foreign mission, but maybe there are longer term, more positive effects that could happen. Yeah, so hopefully. Yes?
Well, so I was just curious, do you have any data on just like baseline familiarity with Cystic among Guatemalans?
Yes. So this is knowledge of Cystic over time, and what this is percentage of respondents who do not know what Cystic is. So this is 2010, 2012, and 2017. Those are the only places where this question was asked. And so you can see that 2010, about a third of the population did not know who they were, between a quarter and a third. But by 2017, we're down to just 4% of the population who does not know who they are. And we didn't ask them a question like, please explain to us what Cystic is, or even like a multiple choice, but we asked people, are you familiar with Cystic? And this was sort of the response. So our experiment is 2015, just to remind you, so we're someplace between this 28% and the 4% when we ran our experiment. Yes.
Do Cystic or other like DA, do they typically try to, like a public affairs wing or anything like that, push some of their successes onto the state apparatus, like sort of advertise that it is a joint operation and try to build that legitimacy in the state, or do they generally stick to their mandate without kind of involving themselves in like attitude adjustment?
This is a great question. So there have been a few different heads of Cystic, and they've taken different strategies. Some of them, the first one in particular, was much more outgoing in terms of like trying to raise awareness and support for Cystic. And then there were a couple who kind of just buckled down and did their job without thinking so much about it. But in the final years of Cystic, there's actually something started called like, in English, like Thursdays, the Cystic Thursdays. So basically they would tweet about things that they had been doing on Thursdays. Like every Thursday, they would tweet about it. Not what they had been doing on Thursdays, they would tweet on Thursdays. So in those moments, what we can do is, we're hoping to do is go back and analyze the Twitter data to see what kind of capacity transfer they're talking about, because it's true, they could have just been taking credit for missions and saying, we're working on this case, it's going well, or, we're thinking about this, and we should get reform on this. Or they may be saying like, oh, did you see Bessie's win on this particular case? So we don't have the Twitter data yet, but we are hoping to get it and do that analysis. That is one way that they were systematically engaging with sort of media and the broader popular opinion in the last few years of their mission. Yeah, it's a great suggestion. We would like to think about other ways to do this as well, like leader statements, things like that. We look at. Yes.
Yeah, can you speak a little bit more about what like the general or the DAs, the delegation agreements look like? Because this one seems like it was really focused on the prosecution, the state prosecution capacity. Are there ones that also maybe build in more like legislative focuses on strengthening legal institutions to allow for kind of capacity building while they're there to kind of shore up other parts, or even training politicians and kind of filling the politician pipeline?
Yeah.
On like longer term stuff?
It's a great question. So I think I have not seen any missions that focus more on the politician side. But I think your question gets it. So I think there are two dimensions of variation that can be really interesting among the delegation agreements. And the first point that you mentioned is one of the things that they do differ on. So how much are they either mandated to or allowed to intervene in the state institutions in order to promote change? Either the legislative structure or more often the executive structure to actually be able to pin down reforms. And so I divide the general delegation agreements into two different forms. One I call full delegation and one I call partial delegation. So Cystic is very much a partial delegation where they're allowed to make decisions together with their counterparts and they can make recommendations. But Ramsey in Solomon Islands was a case in which Australia led a Pacific Islands Forum intervention. And in that case, they actually did take over bureaus. So for example, the police chief, there were two police chiefs. The police chief who was really in charge was the external outside Australian police chief. and then there was a domestic counterpart, but technically in terms of like who had final say on it, it was the foreign actor in that case. It was still a temporary mission, and ultimately there was still like a head, head of state was from the Solomon Islands, but it allowed much more authority to be passed to the outside actor in order to make reform. So I think there's potential differences between the full and the partial delegation agreements. We would love to get more funding and be able to run an experiment like this. What we do have is that Ramsey ran periodic surveys. They didn't ask experimental questions, but I'm hoping to use those to at least look at levels of trust there. And then, so that's the first dimension that we may get variation. And then the second dimension which we get variation, I think, is actually sort of the issue area. So Cystic is very much about corruption, and it's focused on the investigation and prosecution side. We also see special tribunals, which are kind of within this domain, but on the court side. The other set of missions that I think are really interesting are the policing missions, right? And in some ways they do look very different, and we might expect different outcomes if you're sort of handing over your police to an outside actor versus handing over your courts or some aspect of an outside actor. So there, the Rob Blair piece that I mentioned on Liberia really is about policing. There are lots of other missions that look like that would be interesting to explore too. Yeah, so I think those two dimensions of variation could both be really interesting. Yeah.
As a quick follow-up to that, do you have the same expectation for an international mission that's focused more on capacity building rather than corruption? Because it seems like the Guatemala case is really the delegation, the agreement is internationals coming in because of the high prevalence of corruption, which is one reason why people may not go to the police or trust the courts. They also may not go to the police or trust the courts because of the lack of capacity. And in that world, it may be the case that having internationals come in and kind of just bolster those institutions by develop trust.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have like a separate paper about, I think that in general these invited interventions, so times in which states are asking for intervention, fall into basically two categories. On the one hand, we have just capacity building missions where you're getting foreign actors coming in just to police an area or help take back control of an area, right? But they don't have any mandate to reform the institutions, and in many cases they probably don't want to push for that because they're like close allies. And then you have these delegation agreements, which are very much in the other camp, which are about strengthening the institutions, and so reform is a crucial component here. I haven't thought a lot about what those capacity building missions mean in terms of citizen perceptions, but it certainly would be a really interesting question. The paper that we're writing as sort of a spin-off to this is an idea that basically there probably is a correlation, we found a correlation so far, between places in which there's a really high coup risk and inviting in these kinds of capacity, like I call them state backing institutions, right? So they're not trying to state build and reform, they're just trying to state back. And I think it's like a nice way for leaders to say, like, we don't want to strengthen our own military, but maybe we'll bring in this outside actor to help us get control. So I think there are key differences between the state backing and state building institutions. And certainly I could think about, or missions, and certainly I could think about why there would be differences in terms of citizen perceptions too. But I'm not actually sure which way it would go, right? Like, yeah, it would be interesting to know, but I don't have a clear hypothesis on that. Yes?
What's the role of Guatemalan politicians in getting those in Cystic into Guatemala, and how do they interact with Cystic? Do they kind of like use it as on their platform to endorse it, or do they like credit claim with it, or do they critique it, or like, that's the story in the foreign aid, I think, because like politicians use it as a signal to say, oh yeah, we brought in all those foreign aid, and it's kind of like a signal, a positive signal about it.
Yeah.
So I was wondering about this relationship.
That's a great question. Yeah, in some ways you could think about Cystic being a negative signal, right? Because it does sort of indicate weakness. But there is some credit claiming going on. There's a really interesting dynamic whereby often Cystic is brought in, or missions like Cystic are brought in towards the end of a president's term, who either thinks they're going to leave based on number of coup threats that are happening in the country, or they are about to term out, which is the case of the Guatemalan president when they actually signed Cystic. Like, they can't stay in any longer, and their party's not doing so well in the polls. They have a one-term system in Guatemala for presidents. So often, like, the candidates are very supportive of Cystic. When they're talking, when they're campaigning, they say, oh, this is good anti-corruption, like, we're all about this, we fully support Cystic, including the latest president, Jimmy Morales, his, like, whole campaign, he was very supportive of Cystic. Once they get into office, though, and start getting investigated by Cystic, their perceptions almost always change, and I think that's why it's interesting and important to lock in these institutions over time. So Cystic has a 3-year mandate that can be renewed. And so there were a number of other renewals at which people thought they might get kicked out, but it wasn't until Jimmy Morales actually finally was able to kick them out and he turned against them once they started investigating his family for campaign finance violations. So I think there is sort of this interesting dynamic of the politicians, both their personal interests, right, because they're like happy to screen out corruption from their opponents, right, and make sure their hands are tied as they're like leaving office, but then, and as they're coming into office, they're saying good things about this, gives them good press, but then once they're in office, they often impose sort of restrictions on it. So it is a super interesting relationship. That's actually my book project is about why politicians in general would want to bring in outside actors into these missions, and I think it's basically a hands tying story, right? Under certain conditions, you either want to signal you're restraining yourself, or you want to signal that you're restraining your opponent as you're leaving office. Yes?
This has a slightly different direction of the question, but I was thinking about how do things like more informal community justice systems work and play into opinions on Cystic and the National Police, whether they feel like their justice strategies are working for themselves and their own communities, and they don't really feel like they need to go to the police because they trust each other more than something like the government, and whether you, and I don't know much about Guatemala, I'm thinking about somewhere else, but how if that plays in at all.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the paper that I mentioned that Rob Blair wrote on Liberia was explicitly trying to test how many people would shift from using customary justice institutions to using the state justice institutions or policing institutions. And he finds a positive effect there. In Guatemala, there's great work on lynchings in Guatemala by Gina Bateson, who's at Yale. And her dissertation was on this, about where communities would use lynchings as like a justice mechanism in the post-conflict period. And basically she finds a strong correlation with places that experienced a lot of conflict during the Civil War. And so it may be sort of like a mechanism for resecuring your community, even like punishing relatively minor offenses with a pretty massive punishment. We have not run those data against anything having to do with Cystic yet. And as I mentioned, Cystic's reach has not gone very far outside of Guatemala City yet. So it would probably be harder to test, although they did sort of do outreach and they built some outer offices in their last couple of years on the ground. So we might be able to do something more with that. But it is, in general, I think it's an important question, right? Because it both shows the shift towards trust the state potentially or not. And then also it's just like an interesting question.
Yeah, I partially asked because this isn't a post-conflict, it's, I guess, the development of conflict in Burkina Faso, where as conflict erupted, they became less and less trustful of the state police and the state military and became more trustworthy of like traditional justice systems, which then led to more inflamed violence because obviously, breakdown of the systems and all of that.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
more of a current conflict kind of thing than a post-conflict scenario.
Yes, although then how much they shift back to the
Yeah.
to the state institutions if there is a program like this put in place in some of these cases would be super interesting. Yeah, there's some great work on, especially in West Africa, the customary institutions, and so potentially with the data that we're building on these outside of interventions, you could sort of explore both, are causally, like, do they go into places that have more or fewer customary institutions, and what effect do they have on the customary institution use, which I think would both be some interesting questions.
Yeah, I'm thinking if this work is as interesting as it is depressing.
Thank you.
And let me kind of phrase this as a little bit of a scope condition question. So, okay, so here, I mean, the fundamental legitimacy question is about the ability of the police to cope with, we'll call it apolitical crime, right?
Yeah.
And this certainly, I mean, that's really what's going on in Guatemala and some other post-conflict states. There are other conflicts where there is not so much concern about apolitical crime, but more violence, but about political violence. And so, like, you know, say Afghanistan, okay? And so then it's more like, the key question of state legitimacy is not so much, do I trust the state to effectively and non-corruptly deal with, you know, apolitical interpersonal violence? It's, you know, do I give my loyalty to the state or to the political warlords or to the rebels,
Yeah.
I suppose?
Yeah.
And so I, you know, this isn't like a critique of what you guys are doing, but my question is, first of all, does your theory port over to this other category of political violence and political legitimacy? And if it doesn't, or in one way to think about it is, would we be more likely to expect this kind of successful transference in the political versus the non-political violence? And really where I'm going with this is, can you give me some thread of hope that Afghanistan will have more successful transference than maybe we've had in Guatemala?
I'm a pessimist on Afghanistan, so I'm not going to be able to give you any hope there. But I think the broader question is a great one. So we think that actually the similarities between the state building literature and the policing literature are really striking. And the state building literature is often focused on how do you get people away from competitors, right, which is about political violence. So I think there probably is a strong role for the citizen perceptions in either case, right, that you're trusting the state. What I think is a really interesting question here is getting back to this question about if you have a state backing mission versus a state building mission, right? If you know you live in a corrupt society where crime is like your number one problem and you think if like you see a crime, like nobody is gonna help you out. I think there what we expect is that people are gonna want institutions reformed, right? And so that's where these like state building missions look really critical to us. In terms of the political violence, I think that people often in those contexts are, and we know this from some of the research on citizens in post-conflict contexts, are more weighing like which side is likely to do better in the longer run, which one has the capacity to even hold down any kind of like stability. And so there you may actually get these more positive effects of just state backing missions, right? Like you can just get an ally to come in and help you police a territory until you can get control over it. I think you might have a more positive effect on that, on the political violence question. So I think this does apply in theory to the political violence questions as well, but I think in some of those contexts, people are much more likely to just be trying to get an ally to come in and back them, not to actually do like the state building work of reform. Which then I think brings us to this question about like the Afghanistans of the world, or these places where there isn't sort of like a settled conflict yet. And I think we just don't, like in these contexts, before you have some sort of peace agreement, right, I think we're in a very different world compared to afterwards, which I know we're calling the US-Taliban process a peace agreement, but it's really not, right? It's a truce between the US and the Taliban. The Afghan process, which will come next, is what's going to set the conditions for an agreement.
I mean, that's all very interesting. Just to follow up a little bit, I mean, for me, the key question is, it seems like there's a possibility of a different kind of transference process. One is on just pure capacity, and the other is on legitimacy. And here, I think your story seems to be more legitimacy and kind of the apolitical crime, which makes sense. And for the political, category, in your response, you were speculating it probably more as on capacity than legitimacy, in the sense that the citizens are just making these very materialist calculations as to who's more powerful, right? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair in the short term.
Yeah.
Right, I think what we don't know is actually the longer term. So when I read this review piece with Ellie Berman about sort of like what we know about counterinsurgency, and I think there we know a lot about like winning hearts and minds in the short term, which we ended up calling like renting hearts and minds, can reduce the levels of violence that your side is experiencing, right? And I think that's where the capacity building missions would come in, right? Like just getting people to sort of side with you temporarily. But I think if you don't also get that sort of legitimacy building, and that's where the state building after the conflict comes in, if you don't get that kind of transfer of people's beliefs to that institution, you may then have a harder time like doing the policing in the longer term. And I think that's actually why we see such high levels of crime in many of these post-conflict contexts, right? These are problems that seem to go together. If we look at Central America, but also if we look at South Africa, Mozambique, right, we have other places that have really high rates of crime in the aftermath of the civil conflict. And I think part of the decision why is that we can kind of separate out this capacity from legitimacy during a conflict, but really to get this longer term building of the state, we'll need legitimacy, whether it's about political conflict or crime, and likely we're going to get some combination of both in most of these cases. So the longer term, I think this looks more like the question of in political violence contexts. But in the short term, capacity being sort of the key.
Any other questions or comments? Actually, do have, I'm sorry, just one more question, sorry. I mean, I have a million questions, but I'll just do one more. Okay, so I'm trying to think about this from a policy point of view, like facing this problem, like how would a policymaker try to get around it?
Yes.
And one way one might be able to get around it would be very transparent training. Right, in the sense, what you did is, part of the state building process was not just having different people there, but training the locals, and then have some really public stamp of, okay, you just passed some kind of training process. And I was thinking about this in terms of sometimes, the National Committee will train security forces, and then they get new uniforms and so forth.
Yeah.
And I know this is really outside of your study, but do you think that that kind of public training might be able to more effectively get the transference effectively?
I think there's a possibility that it might be, and this is one of the reasons why we're really interested in that Twitter data in terms of like what Cystic is talking about for its capacity transfer, because our guess is that they're relatively public about that, and it may be in their interest to be even more public about that if what they really want to do is strengthen the state institutions, which is the stated goal of Cystic. Like, they really believe in this like example setting ethos, that this will ultimately strengthen the state. So I think that's question number one for me. If I were a policymaker, I think this is like sort of a nice journey to go about how transparent you make it, how much you publicize, how much transfer you're giving. You don't want to go too far on this, I think, because you don't want to be seen as being embedded in the state institutions, right? So you still need these to be foreign actors. I think the other question for us, which is in response to the first question, I said we are interested in going back now that Cystic has left, because I think it's possible that there are broader positive effects that happen once you no longer have this comparison to the outside actor, but you can remember sort of like the positive effects that it's had in terms of transfer. So the longer term picture, I think maybe slightly more optimistic than these sort of short term results. I mean, these are like, Cystic forced the president to step down. So there certainly were very positive effects on particular cases. But in terms of the state building, I think it's either making this much more public and transparent, or hoping for sort of a longer term effect, which we might be able to test in this case or other cases in ways that would be really interesting.
Can I ask one real quick question? How do you think social power structures within the country impact this stuff? So I'm thinking of like sexism in Mexico and the state police violence against women, women all marching recently to like combat that. And then in I think Chile, also that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then there's or like racism. I'm thinking of Black Lives Matter in the United States, and how those kinds of things impact whether they'd be more trusting of Cystic, because Cystic isn't inherently strapped with the same kind of power structure issues as maybe a national or a government or a local police, and how maybe any of that impacts this stuff.
Yeah, these are super interesting questions. We actually have a graduate student at Berkeley, Vanessa Navarro Rodriguez, who is working on the question of like, if you have peacekeepers coming in who have better training on like gender issues, will they be less likely to carry out like sexual exploitation and abuse while they're in country, right? But you could see this also potentially transferring to this capacity transfer question of like, if they have better training on these gender or structural racism dimensions, might they also have stronger effects in terms of like capacity building? I have not seen anybody exploring that particular question, although there is an alum from here, from Emory, Sabrina Kareem, who does look at sort of like questions of if you have more gender inclusiveness in these post-conflict institutions, do you get better outcomes for like women in terms of reporting crimes that mainly affect women? So her work on Liberia suggests some positive effects there, which is really interesting. She's now a professor at Cornell, if you want to look her up, but she's a PhD from here.
Any other questions? Great, thank you so much. Very
Thank you.
interesting.